Hello, everyone, and thank you again to the Field Studies Council and to Dan for the invitation and for making this all happen behind the scenes. I'm Dr. Xirocostas, and I'm a Chancellor's Research Fellow at the University of Technology, Sydney, where I work as a plant ecologist. And my research sits at the intersection of two main questions, which is one, how plants respond to environmental change, and two, what happens when plants find themselves somewhere entirely new. And today I want to take you on a journey between two very different places. The UK, where so many of our world's most loved wildflowers evolved, and then Australia, where some of those same plants have become some serious ecological disruptors. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm presenting this talk from the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I also think that as a scientist working in Australia, that it's really important I recognise that our first scientists were the Indigenous peoples of this land. So, a little bit about me before we dive into the topic. I'm a plant ecologist, which means I spend a lot of my time thinking about why plants grow where they do, how they respond to stress, and what happens when the rules of their environment suddenly change. And as you can see from these images on screen, a lot of my research involves being outside, either in the field, observing pollinators, collecting insects, or recording plant abundance. And I've been super lucky in my career to be able to travel to many different places internationally for my fieldwork, including across Europe and Australia. However, more recently, I've actually been putting my green thumb to a bit more work, and I'm currently running three simultaneous glasshouse experiments, which I would not recommend to anyone if you want to maintain your sanity. But these experiments are to understand how Australian plant species are going to respond to future climate conditions, such as heat stress and drought at various different life stages. So, as you can see from the photos, there's a lot of work involved here, from collecting seeds in the field, germinating them in incubators on agar, potting the seedlings, and then, of course, monitoring them over the course of their experiments. And I also managed to single-handedly clean out my local hardware store of potting mix, which you can see in that photo on the bottom, second from the left. And they just managed to fit in my little car. Lastly, I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the outreach and advocacy work I've been involved in. So, what's the point of doing science if you don't spread the good word about it, or at least try and convince politicians to fund science better, which is what was happening in that top left photo there. But in all seriousness, I do like to get involved in committees, such as being on the board of the Ecological Society of Australia. And I've also been involved in public outreach to schools and university students to try and encourage them to pursue STEM careers because, as we know, we really need more scientists out there to help discover how we're going to solve our world's big problems. That's enough about me. Let's get into the topic. So, I really wanted to start off this talk by telling you how this webinar came to be. So, I was at the British Ecological Society conference in December last year, and I stumbled across none other than the Field Studies Council. And they were selling these lovely little field guides of urban plants in northern England, which is on the screen. Now, to you lovely folk across the pond, these look like your typical harmless plants you'd see, growing in meadows. But for an Australian like me, I was actually quite shocked because a lot of these species in this guide have been introduced to Australia and are actually considered to be quite problematic. So this prompted some conversation with the really lovely ladies at the booth who listened to me babble for about 10 minutes about this before they eventually invited me to come give a talk. So that is how I became to be on your screen today. Some of the plants that caught my eye in that field guide included those that are on the screen, such as self-heal, white clover, the oxeye daisy, and the creeping buttercup. And these might actually be blooming now over in England since it's June. And these are actually all images that I've taken myself in Australia during some of my field work where I looked at introduced plants, which I'll touch on a little later. But it's not just the plants that we've inherited from the UK. We also have some of your animals too, like foxes, hares, rabbits, and mice. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? These plants and animals just exist and they're part of the ecosystem. And yes, that might be true for you in the UK, but in Australia, it's a much different story. So, to understand why invasions hit Australia so hard, you really need to understand what makes Australia quite extraordinary in the first place. So, Australia has been isolated and surrounded by ocean for roughly 45 to 50 million years, and that is an almost incomprehensible amount of evolutionary time. So, during that period, the plants, animals, and soil organisms on the continent were developing on their own rules. They had their own networks of interaction with just no input from the Northern Hemisphere. The soils here are ancient and quite nutrient poor in ways that are very unusual on a global scale. And many Australian plants have evolved highly specialized strategies to survive on almost nothing. They have waxy leaves to reduce water loss. They have lignotubers that resprout after fires come through. And they have partnerships with specific soil fungi that help them extract nutrients from soil. So these adaptations make Australian species quite remarkable, but also remarkably vulnerable because they've evolved without any exposure to the organisms that would arrive with European settlement. And the result of all of that isolation is pretty amazing biodiversity. So, around 85% of Australia's flowering plants are found nowhere else on Earth. If you walk through any piece of intact Australian bush, almost everything you'll see is endemic, meaning it evolved here and it only exists here. We have some iconic genera like eucalyptus, acacia, banksia, grevillea, and each of these genera contain hundreds of species within them, and almost all of them are just found in Australia and nowhere else. So it's really this endemism that makes invasions so conspicuous and so damaging here. When a plant from a completely different evolutionary context arrives and begins spreading, it's not slotting into a gap, but it's entering a system that just has no prior experience of it. There's no insects that have evolved to eat it, no pathogens that have evolved to attack it. There's just no natural breaks. And that brings us to the species that are doing the arriving. But first, I want to be a bit precise about language because not every species that's introduced to a new place becomes invasive. In fact, many introductions entirely fail, and others establish small populations and stay quite contained. It's only quite a small subset that eventually aggressively spreads and displaces native species and alters how ecosystems function. Those are the ones that we call invasive. One of the most important and least appreciated features of biological invasions is actually the lag phase. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but it's just this first starting time here, the lag phase. And many species that are invasive sit quietly for years in this lag space, even decades after they're introduced, before they suddenly exponentially expand. So during this lag, they might be building up genetic diversity, establishing below the radar, or waiting for a disturbance event like a drought or a fire to come through, giving them an opening. So this makes early detection of invasive species often quite difficult, and it means that by the time a species is visibly spreading, it's often already very hard to control. So we talked before about what sorts of animals us Aussies have inherited from the UK, but how did they get here? So when European settlers arrived in Australia from the late 18th century, they brought their familiar species with them, partly for food and pest control, and partly because they simply missed home. So foxes were introduced for recreational hunting, hares and rabbits arrived as a food source, and both decisions turned out to be quite catastrophic. So the red fox is has been implicated in the extinction or decline of many native species, like ground nesting birds, small marsupials, and lizards, because none of them had evolved with a predator like this fox, so they had no defense. On the other hand, hares and rabbits, by the time they reached sort of plague-like numbers in the late 19th century, they were just stripping vegetation across millions of hectares. They were destabilizing topsoil and outcompeting our native grazers. The mice, on the other hand, were most likely a stowaway on ships. So they were an accidental introduction, but they brought in disease and they caused nuisances to farmers and households, probably not dissimilar to what they are like in the UK. Now, I thought I'd show you some other plant examples because there's far more types of plants than there are animals that have been introduced to Australia from the UK. So on the left, we have the blackberry bush, which, according to the internet, is used in hedging in the UK. I'm sure you can correct me on that in question time if I've got that wrong. But in Australia, it forms these really thick, impenetrable thickets that are meters deep and just exclude native plants from being able to grow underneath it. They also provide shelter for foxes and rabbits, and because of this, it's listed as a weed of national significance by the Australian government. Then on the right, we have Patterson's curse, which blooms a vivid purple and it actually looks quite beautiful from a distance. But in Australia, it covers millions of hectares of farmland and native grassland, and it's very toxic to grazing animals in large quantities. But what's really interesting is that you likely won't find the plants here in such vast, dense quantities in the UK as you do in Australia. And I'll explain a little later why that is. So, Australia has roughly 3,000 introduced plant species established in the wild. Now, they're not all from the UK, but a lot of them are. So, these aren't in cultivation, these are just spreading in natural and semi-natural ecosystems. Of those plant species, a subset have been identified as particularly damaging and are listed as weeds of national significance, and that triggers national coordinated management. So the economic costs of these invasive species are quite staggering. Over 4 billion Australian dollars a year are lost in agricultural productivity alone. And that doesn't even account for the ecological costs, which are the loss of native species, the disruption of ecosystem services, and the alteration of fire regimes, which are really important in Australian ecosystems. In some regions, unfortunately, introduced plants now cover more ground than native vegetation, like you can see in the image, where the native landscape is in places becoming the minority. So the question that scientists like me spend our time on is what makes some of these species so successful, and why are they so successful in Australia than they are at home in their native range? And the first part of that answer has been known in ecology for a few decades now. So, in the native range, every plant is embedded in an ecological community. There are insects that have spent millions of years co-evolving with it, developing the ability to eat their leaves, parasitize their seeds, drink their nectar. Then there are fungal pathogens that have evolved to exploit a plant's particular chemistry. And there are herbivores whose gut flora can break down specific compounds. So all of these different interactions keep a plant's population in check. And they're metabolically costly to deal with. So the plant is constantly investing energy and defense rather than in growth or reproduction. So when they cross the ocean, the plant will arrive in Australia, and none of those co-evolved enemies are there. The insects won't recognize it. The pathogens have no key that will fit the lock. The native herbivores find them unpalatable or simply don't encounter it. So now this plant in its new range is deemed free from its enemies. And this idea was coined the enemy release hypothesis, most influentially by Keane and Crawley in 2002, and it's become one of the cornerstones of invasion biology. And the logic to this is quite simple. So if a plant no longer needs to invest energy in defenses, so bitter compounds, tough leaf structures, or sticky resins that keep herbivores and pathogens at bay, it can redirect that energy into growth and reproduction. And the result is plants that are often measurably larger, produce more seeds, spread more aggressively than their home range counterparts. And we see this in the field. So Australian populations of introduced UK plants are frequently much more vigorous and aggressive in their spread than the same species in UK populations. So if escaping your enemies is all you need to succeed, then surely every plant that crosses an ocean should become invasive. But that's not really what we observe. So most introduced species establish small populations and stay contained. Some fail entirely. There's clearly something operating against invasion success that enemy release just doesn't account for. And one explanation, and one that my research engages with, is what happens if or when a plant's enemies get behind. It's not just the plant's enemies, but it's their friends as well. So plants are not solitary organisms. They're actually nodes in a network of mutualistic relationships or partnerships where both parties benefit. The most visible of these is pollination. So most flowering plants depend on animals to transfer pollen, such as bees, hoverflies, butterflies, moths, beetles, and more. And many of these pollinators are specialists, meaning they've evolved to visit particular plant species, being attracted by specific flower shapes, colors, scents, and reward structures. Below the ground, most plants depend on mycorrhizal fungi, which are microscopic threads that extend the plant's root system and help it absorb different nutrients from the soil. A lot of the times without these fungi, many of these plants just can't grow properly. And then there's the seed dispersers, so birds and mammals that eat fruits and deposit their seeds elsewhere. So when a plant crosses the ocean, yes, it leaves behind its enemies, but it also leaves behind these partners too. The Miss Mutualist hypothesis formalizes this idea that introduced plants might perform worse in their new range, not because of anything attacking them, but because they've lost those partners that they depend on. And pollination is particularly important here. If a specialist bee or hoverfly that visits a plant in the UK isn't present in Australia, and if an Australian native pollinator doesn't come and visit this unfamiliar flower, then the plant might produce far fewer seeds than it would at home. So this then creates a reproductive bottleneck. The plant can grow, it's escaped its enemies, but it struggles to reproduce effectively enough to spread aggressively like most introduced or invasive species. So this gives us a much more nuanced picture of invasion. Enemy release and mutualism loss are pulling in opposite directions, and the outcome for any particular species might just depend on which of these forces wins. So now I want to bring your attention to some of my research that I did as a PhD student many moons ago at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. So I wanted to understand whether plant species that are introduced to Australia from the UK and Europe were experiencing enemy release. So to do this, I selected 16 target species that have become naturalized in Australia, and then I followed them back home. And luckily for me, I conducted all of my fieldwork in 2019, just before the global pandemic shut the whole world down. I was in the field for 8 months straight, searching and collecting data from these plants across their native range, which included the UK, Spain, France, Austria, and Estonia. And then I also collected data from these plants across their introduced range of Australia, which included 7 locations across the East Coast. But before I go any further, I do need to acknowledge that this work was an absolutely massive feat that would not have been possible if it weren't for my amazing collaborators who spent so much time with me in the field, helped me locate plants, process data, and eventually lead to the papers that were published from this work. So, to understand if these plants were experiencing enemy release, I measured how much they were being eaten by herbivores in their native range and their introduced ranges. And these images were both taken in the UK, where the plants could sometimes be completely decimated. And so, for me, estimating how much of the plant was left behind would actually be quite tricky. So after recording leaf damage on over 11,000 leaves, I ended up finding that these species were indeed experiencing enemy release because they were being eaten more in Europe and the UK than they were in Australia. I also wanted to test whether climate factors like increased precipitation, higher temperatures, or humidity might affect the strength of enemy release that the plants received, but none of those factors were related. But I did find that species that had been in Australia for a longer amount of time had spread further than those that had only recently arrived. And this result isn't just unsurprising, but it's also been supported by many other studies out there. So while I was out on my whirlwind field trip, I also spent time observing the pollinators that visited these plants to see if they were also missing their mutualists in Australia. And this involved some pretty therapeutic field work of setting myself up next to a beautiful patch of flowers, setting a 15-minute timer, and recording all of the beautiful little critters that came into contact with them. And I found that my target species were in fact missing their mutualists. So in Europe and the UK, these species were visited by 2.6 times more pollinators with 1.8 times greater taxonomic richness than their conspecifics in Australia. And I also found that the taxonomic assemblage of pollinators that would visit these plants differed in 7 out of the 10 species that I targeted. So that brings us to the question of if plants are receiving fewer visits from a lower richness of pollinators, then how on earth are they able to thrive in these new environments? And for this, I came up with 3 possible explanations. The first is that these plants could have evolved to self-fertilize and actually no longer need the help of pollinators to successfully reproduce. And this has been found in some species when they go to new ranges, just not in the species that I've particularly studied. The second is that the few pollinators that do visit these plants might just be doing a really outstanding job of transferring pollen. So the plants are still setting similar quantities of seed in the introduced range as they would in the native range. And finally, the cost of having less pollinators might be outweighed by the benefit of having fewer enemies around. But to really know the answer, more studies are needed to disentangle these mechanisms. This really is just the tip of the iceberg. So before I move on, I feel like I have introduced quite a lot of complex invasion mechanisms to you, so I just wanted to tie it all together. So the main point is that crossing the ocean does 2 things to a plant simultaneously, and they pull in in opposite directions. On the one hand, you have the plant that escapes the insects, the pathogens, and the herbivores that they've been co-evolving with for millennia. So the plant no longer needs to invest in costly defenses. It can grow larger, faster, and produce more biomass. But then on the other hand, or the other side of the rope, it's also left behind its pollinators, its beneficial fungi or seed dispersers that it depends on to reproduce and spread. So whether a given species becomes aggressively invasive or stays contained may depend critically on which of these forces dominates for that particular species in a specific context. So as I said, this is a very active area of research, and we just don't have a complete picture yet of what this means or how we can predict what plants are most likely to, experience more Miss Mutualist or more enemy release. But, you know, it's a work in progress, and hopefully we'll be able to see what it can do to help predict invasions. Um, but before I get to what we can do about invasions, I also want to give you a flip side to this story. So, everything I've described so far has been about UK species coming to Australia. But I want to be clear that Australia isn't just a victim in this story. The traffic does go both ways. So, Australian species have spread to other parts of the world, and in some cases, they're causing significant ecological and economic damage. And this matters for how we frame the problem. Biological invasion isn't just something that happens to certain countries, but it's a global bidirectional phenomenon driven by trade, travel, horticulture, and agriculture. And no one country is only a donor or a receiver of these species. Perhaps the most striking example of an Australian species causing problems elsewhere is the eucalyptus in southern Europe. So eucalypts were planted extensively across Portugal, Spain, and parts of France through the 20th century for timber and for paper pulp production. They grow extraordinarily fast, which makes them really economically attractive. But what wasn't really appreciated at the time was what they would do to fire dynamics. So, eucalyptus leaves contain high concentrations of volatile oils, the same compounds that give them their really distinct scent. And these oils are very highly flammable. In Australia, where fire is a natural part of the ecosystem and native plants have co-evolved with it, this is manageable. In the fire-prone landscapes of the Iberian Peninsula, however, introducing a tree that acts as a fuel accelerant has been very catastrophic. The fires in Portugal in 2017, which killed over 100 people and burned through enormous areas of eucalyptus plantation, these trees not only burned more intensely than native vegetation, but they created the conditions for the fires to spread even faster. Another example are the Australian acacias that are in South Africa. So several Australian wattle species were introduced to South Africa in the 19th century, primarily for dune stabilization along the coast or for timber and as ornamental plants, and they established extremely successfully. And unfortunately, they are now among the most damaging invasive plants in the Cape Floristic region, which is one of the 6 plant biodiversity hotspots on Earth and home to an astonishing variety of endemic plants that are just found nowhere else. So these acacias form dense thickets that exclude the native fynbos vegetation and consume enormous quantities of water in an already water scarce environment. But plants are not the only Australian invaders. The common brush-tailed possum is one of our most familiar marsupials. So in the native range of Australia, it's kept in check by dingoes, pythons, quolls, disease, and also competition with other native species. And so it's part of that functioning ecological web. However, in 1837, possums were deliberately introduced to New Zealand to establish a fur trade. New Zealand, like Australia, is an ancient island landmass with a lot of endemism. But unlike Australia, it had no native land mammals at all before human arrival, apart from bats. So its birds, insects, and plants had evolved over millions of years with no mammalian browsers or predators. So the Australian possum arrived into a system with no predators capable of controlling it, no plants that have evolved chemical defenses against their browsing, and no diseases that actively targeted it. So the result was a population boom. Estimates of the current New Zealand possum population range up to 30 million animals, and they browse the canopy relentlessly. Some native tree species have defoliation rates that prevent their entire regeneration. And they also predate bird eggs and chicks, including many of New Zealand's iconic and already threatened endemic birds. So, what do we do about this? Well, the most effective intervention is one that happens before a species ever arrives. Australia has responded to its experience of invasive species by developing some of the most rigorous biosecurity systems in the world. Travelers must declare all plant material, including seeds, fruit, plant products. All cargo is screened, and there are strict quarantine protocols for importing plants for research or horticulture. And I know this firsthand because I've had to do it, and I will never design a project where I require importing plants because of it. But I understand it's for a very good purpose. So this matters because of the lag phase that we discussed earlier. A new introduction might not visibly spread for 10 or 20 years, and then by the time it becomes a problem, it's everywhere. So the window for effective early intervention is very short. It also matters because of how seeds travel. So they hide on soil in boots, they stick to clothing and packaging, and they can contaminate grain shipments. So biosecurity in Australia isn't just about customs, but it's also about awareness at every single level of that supply chain. I recently went to New Zealand in May on a bit of an adventure holiday and I did lots of hiking. So when I got back to Australia, I experienced this firsthand. I had to declare that I'd been in a wilderness area. They took my hiking boots, they gave them a good scrub down, and that was actually pretty good for me because then I didn't have to wash them at home myself. So, if invasive plants thrive partly because they've escaped their co-evolved enemies, then one response could be to reintroduce those enemies deliberately. And this is the principle of classical biological control. The most famous example in Australian history is the use of the moth Cactoblastus cactorum to control the prickly pear, which is on the screen. So by the 1920s, the prickly pear, which was introduced from South America, had spread across 25 million hectares of Queensland and New South Wales, making the land almost unusable, and nothing could really stop it. But 5 years later, in 1925, the Cactoblastus moth was imported from Argentina, where it had co-evolved with the prickly pear for millennia. Its caterpillars bore holes into the cactus pads and destroyed them. And within a decade, the prickly pear had been reduced pretty much to a fraction of its former coverage. So it remains one of the most successful biological control operations pretty much ever undertaken. However, biocontrol isn't without its risks. The cane toad, which some of you might have heard of, is the most notorious cautionary tale of biocontrol. It was introduced to Queensland in 1935 to control beetles that were attacking sugarcane, and it turned out to be ineffective at controlling the beetles. And then because the cane toad has poisonous bufotoxin in it, anything that would try to eat it would instantly die. And because Australian predators like birds or reptiles didn't co-evolve with the cane toad, they wouldn't know that it was toxic and to avoid it. So the cane toad, while first brought to Australia as a biocontrol agent for a beetle, is now a highly destructive invasive that's affecting native fauna across Australia to this day. Now, thankfully, modern biocontrol programs are far more cautious. Before any agent is released, it undergoes extensive host range testing to demonstrate that it will only attack the target weed and will not harm native plants or any other non-target organisms. And this process takes years and it's very heavily regulated. One of the quite exciting developments in recent years is the application of technology to combat invasive species. So, weed detection has traditionally required enormous human effort, such as ecologists and land managers doing walking transects and mapping them by hand. However, new AI-assisted image analysis applied to drone and satellite imagery is actually starting to change that. Machine learning models trained on high resolution imagery can now identify invasive plant species at the individual plant level across landscapes, which is quite extraordinary. On the intervention side, precision weeding robots are actually being developed that can autonomously identify and remove or treat individual invasive species. The potential for this is enormous. It's targeted, highly targeted intervention that doesn't require blanket herbicide application. However, this is still in the works and, it'd be very costly. So I'm not sure how much this will be used for species intervention in the near future. However, on the restoration side, rebuilding native vegetation after invasive plants are removed, drone seeding is actually already being deployed in Australia to plant native species at scales that would be impossible to do on foot. And that's what I've pictured on the screen here. Before I close, I wanted to flag a warning note for the future. Climate change and biological invasion aren't separate problems. They interact and in ways that will generally make invasion worse. Many invasive species are currently limited by climate. So, a plant from southern Europe might be unable to survive cold British winters for now, but as temperatures rise, those constraints shift, and species that were constrained may begin to spread into new areas. For example, the invasive cane toad used to only be a problem in tropical northern Australia, but as southern latitudes get warmer, they're starting to spread south. So, at the same time, novel climates, so conditions that have never existed in a given place, may be ones that native species are also poorly adapted to, while introduced species from elsewhere could be pre-adapted. So the playing field is shifting, and we don't know yet all the ways in which it will affect species competition, ecosystem function, and so on. The research being done now to understand the mechanisms of invasion success and failure will be essential to navigate this in the future. But I wanted to end with something practical because I think this audience is exactly the kind of people who can make a difference. So, citizen science data on invasive species is genuinely valuable. Apps like iNaturalist allow you to photograph and log plants, and those records contribute to national and international databases that are used by researchers like myself and land managers as well. Being biosecurity aware matters as well. Cleaning mud off your boots between visiting field sites, not moving soil, and being careful about plants in your garden that might self-seed beyond those boundaries. And finally, native planting matters too. So, a garden planted with native species supports the mutualistic networks like the pollinators, fungi, and seed dispersers that we've been talking about today. So, with that, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you've learnt something new, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that, Zoe. That was really, really interesting. I'm just going to see if anyone's going to pop anything in the chat. While we wait for people to either put up their hand virtually or stick something in the chat, I just want to clarify. Yeah, blackberries we do use them for hedging, and we've got it's almost like a national pastime going blackberry picking, making jam. It's kind of one of
Yeah.
our go-tos. What I found really interesting because I saw it come up on the screen, Patterson's curse, and I was like, that
Yes.
looks a lot like Viper's bug loss. And suddenly dawned on me that actually the colloquial names have changed because of their impact on the ecosystems and what's happening, I'm
Yes.
assuming. So
Yes,
is
exactly.
Patterson, yeah, is Patterson someone who like bought it over? Do we know?
I'm not sure who Patterson is, but the colloquial name, yes, does is impacted by what the species is doing in Australia. So yeah, what you call it over in the UK colloquially is different to what we call it here in Australia, simply because it has become a general curse on the ecosystems over here. But I
It's
don't know who
yeah,
Patterson
it's
is, sorry.
well, surely he's been cursed for the eternity now because of the name. But I thought it was
Exactly,
really interesting because
yeah.
we've got Viper's bug loss because we get it in like packets of wildflower seeds over here because it's really good for pollinators, like, and everyone's pushing it,
Yeah.
and it's just so funny to see that flip side. Well, we
Yeah,
don't
and
want
for
that, just
us,
until
we're
they
like, no, this is so bad.
The other thing I wanted to point out as well is Cactoblastis cactorum is probably up there with one of my favorite binomial names. It just sounds so cool, like
Oh yeah, I know.
Cactoblastis.
Yeah. Yeah,
We
there's no wondering what type of plant that is. Cactoblastis cactorum. Yeah.
we've got one mention in the comments. I don't know who it is. Some ambiguous user has mentioned that Australian soils are comparatively low nutrient. Why is that?
Yes. Yes. So we have ancient soils, I believe. Now I'm going back to my first year geology here. So feel free to fact check this, but I believe it's because of our topography, and we have low nitrogen in our soils. So a lot of our plants are nitrogen fixing, like the fabaceae, so the legumes. They fix nitrogen in nodules in their roots, and that can actually help species around them to access nitrogen, because we have nitrogen poor soils. Um, our soils, I believe, are more phosphorus heavy. When I say heavy, probably not that much, but in terms of the sort of micronutrients in the soils, we have more phosphorus in our soils than nitrogen. Um, yeah.
Amazing, thank you. We've got another question from Ruth Noble, and she's saying that
Mhm.
she lives in Zambia, and we have a problem with Latana, which is Bennasi. Is
Yep.
Latana a problem in Australia, and if so, how is it managed?
Yes. I'm so glad someone brought up lantana. I didn't really focus on it too much in this talk because it's from South America and not from the UK. Lantana is an extremely, extremely invasive species in Australia. I actually have an honors student at the moment, doing a research project looking at how lantana suppresses the soil seed bank underneath the thickets of it. That's happening right now, so I don't have any answers for you. But yes, how we manage it. So it's a lot of manual managing, so slashing, poisoning. But the problem is they just keep coming back. People burn it, but it just keeps growing back. So a lot of the time now, the management is do nothing and try to stop it from spreading, unfortunately, because it grows so large and it's so dense. Um, it's just it costs so much to try and get rid of. You just think, okay, you leave it there, stop it from spreading elsewhere. Unfortunately, that's yeah, what it's come to. However, I have been in contact with some people from the state government, and they're looking at bringing a biocontrol over, a fungus that attacks the lantana leaves, and hopefully that it's in, as I said in the talk, biocontrols go through rigorous testing now, obviously. So it's in that rigorous testing phase where we're trying to understand whether this fungus will just attack the lantana and reduce, its populations, or will it transfer over to other native species or any other species and cause a problem like the cane toads have. So that's where we're at with the lantana in Australia. But yes, it is a massive problem here, unfortunately.
Amazing question, thank you. I've got a sentient Samsung who is asking, is there any way to use genetic engineering in making species more desirable for native species to predate?
That's interesting, and that is not something I'm aware of, but in all honesty, I just don't see the government allowing genetically modified organisms out into the public, into the ecosystems. You could theoretically do it, but I think there'd be a big public uproar, and I just, yeah, it'd be hard to know what other implications it would have on the ecosystem. So That's a spicy question, and it's not something I think that will ever be realized.
Thank you. I have a question as well. So we were
Hmm.
talking about plants allocating resources to growth and reproduction because they don't have
Yep.
to do it with predator avoidance mechanisms. Um, is there a case of that just becomes dormant and it's there if we want to save it for later, or is that something that actively is lost over generations and therefore you end up with a plant that kind of loses that ability at later stages? For example, if you moved it back, would it really struggle, or would it just, oh yeah, I can do this. I just haven't done it for a while.
That's a really good question. So, actually, my PhD supervisor, Professor Angela Moles, kind of touched on this in a different way, not specifically looking at chemical defenses, but looking at just plant traits in general. If you have a plant in its native range and a plant in its introduced range and grow them in the same garden, common garden or glass house, how different will those plants be? And she did this for the Cape weed, which is a daisy from South Africa that grows on sand dunes along the beach. And so the Cape weed was introduced to Australia, I'm gonna say sometime in the 1800s. I could be very wrong. Um, not that long ago though. And what they found, they actually found the source population somewhere in South Africa on a beach that was the source population for all of those that had established in Australia. And what they did was they took the seeds from South Africa and they took the seeds from populations across Australia in the introduced range, grew them in a common garden glasshouse, and they found that even when grown under the same conditions, and even though they'd only been in a new area for, let's say, less than 200 years, these plants looked very different. The leaf shape had changed, the flower size had changed. So in Australia, the flower size was a lot smaller, and in South Africa, it was a lot bigger because in South Africa, it had all of its native pollinators around, so it would need big flowers to attract them. But in Australia, it had actually grown reliant on self-fertilizing. So it didn't need to invest in big flowers, so it could put less energy in making, big flashy flowers for pollinators that were never going to come. And yeah, so they found that these plants have fundamentally changed. Now, if we're looking at chemical defenses, who's to say that that wouldn't have changed to a level where there's just no comparison back to the reference population? So that's my convoluted way of answering your question.
No, that's really,
Yes,
really
it
interesting.
could
And
happen.
no, thank you so much. That's really interesting that actually
Mm.
those features change so much.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it might be a case of if you don't use it, you lose it.
exactly. Yeah.
Uh, I've thank you so much for today. Really great. You've answered all the questions in the chat, and I've got no one else popping a hand up or anything. So we can end the call there. But thank you so much. It's been really interesting and such a different way to look at something we talk about day in, day out across the world. But seeing that from a different perspective, absolutely loved it. So thank you so much. Have you got any sort of last words that you want to share to everyone before we end today?
No, just thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much to everyone for your really great questions. And come to Australia and come visit all the plants that you've brought over here and come see our beautiful native plants too.